Okay, in this particular video we're going to be looking at volcanic hazards in the developing world, so LEDCs. We've already looked at Sakurajima in Japan, which is our MEDC case study, but for this one we're going to be looking at our LEDC case study, which is Mount Nyiragongo in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that's the section that we're going to be looking at the moment. One of the things that you will probably be able to notice as we go through this is the different sorts of consequences that you have from relatively similar hazards. Okay, it can be very devastating in the developing world. First of all, this particular volcano, a little bit of more information about it and a little bit of background information. The volcano itself, Mount Nyiragongo, which is this volcano here, is actually located in the African Rift Valley. One of the things that you should notice about the African Rift Valley is the type of tectonic activity that is going on. So our convection currents are rising up, and it's actually pulling the continental plate apart, and the central sections, as you can see, are just dropping down. So you get volcanic activity in the central part of the Rift Valley, because quite literally it's just pulling excuse me, it's pulling the whole sheet apart, so that entire plate is being ripped, as you can see down this section here. Right, so that's the first thing that's actually going on with Mount Nyiragongo, is that type of tectonic activity. Nyiragongo itself is a stratovolcano and it's over 3,400 metres high. Mainly the magma that will come out of Nyiragongo is basalt, so it has quite a low gas content, and therefore it's not very explosive, so you don't get trapped gas inside, so it's not an explosive volcano. This is the sort of volcano that will erupt runny magma, so it's very, very runny, so the speed of the magma might be increased, but actually when you look at it, it takes away a little bit of the hazard, because it's not explosive. There are obviously gas emissions, and there is a huge lava lake, and it can drain very, very quickly, which moves an awful lot of magma in a short space of time. So consequently that can be quite a serious hazard, especially in this particular region, but it is just not as explosive as Sakurajima, so the hazard is slightly different. Okay. Many people argue that those people living in the developing world, in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, are actually at much greater risk than people living in the developed world in areas like Japan, simply because the people in the Democratic Republic of Congo have got quite risky locations with which they've got to live. Yes, Sakurajima did have, it is a volcano, and there are urban areas around the outside, but in some parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially in this region, there's not really many other places that they can live realistically, so they have risky locations and they can't afford to live elsewhere. I mean, this is fertile soil, it's got a water source, so you can see all around here would be fertile soil. You've got Lake Kivu, which is a good source of water and food, so consequently this is where they live. Many people in the region just can't afford to build safe houses, so you've got safe, well-built houses that could survive some tectonic activity. They just can't really afford that. An awful lot of people don't have any insurance, so if anything does happen, that's it. It's tough. There's no insurance company going to come in and rebuild the house after a claim. It's just not going to happen that way. The government themselves in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's had very little in terms of a functioning government for many, many years. It's been involved in a civil war. Other countries' soldiers have been involved in conflicts within the Democratic Republic of Congo, so consequently it's left it with very, very limited funds to provide any aid. This region itself is quite isolated, so it's got very poor communications, and that means that people can't be warned about what's about to happen. Also, it's very difficult for scientific observers to come in and monitor what's happening in the volcano because of its isolation and the difficulty with which people have to get to this region as well. All of these things linked together mean that the death toll for a hazard like Nyiragongo can be quite high in these regions. When the volcano erupted in 2002, there were an awful lot of consequences that occurred from that. These were social, economic, some environmental consequences, and then obviously you've got the relief effort and potential for future threats afterwards. So we'll have a look at some of those. So after it erupted in 2002, some statistics that are quite important, 12,500 homes were wiped out. In fact, the lava flow actually cut the city of Goma in two. And the unfortunate thing is that the direction that the magma flow took, the lava flow took through the town, cut off the hospital and the airport from the majority of the population. So that just exacerbated the problem and made it much worse. Initially in the eruption, there were 40,000 people evacuated quite early on. That quickly rose to 400,000 people being evacuated from the region. So it's an awful lot of people that were evacuated. 100 people died from poisonous gas emissions, literally suffocating and choking them to death because of the poisonous gas that was erupted from the volcano. Obviously, you're going to have disruption to the infrastructure and to the main amenities. So it cut off the main water supply, which caused problems for the hospital. It caused problems for people in the area, and then that led on to a concern over the spread of disease. If you've got 400,000 evacuees, 12,500 homes destroyed, you've got an awful lot of people that are going to remain homeless. It's soon going to lead to, with there being a lack of clean water, potential for cholera outbreaks. So the health is was quite an issue in this region. But it wasn't just social impacts that were created, there were also economic impacts. It had an economic cost. And a few of those points we're going to cover now. So first of all, when you get a volcano erupting, it erupts sulfur dioxide. In fact, Mount Nyiragongo itself, it's been said, actually erupts or gives off a third of the whole world's sulfur dioxide emissions come from this one volcano. So it's quite high in its sulfur content. This in itself, once it is absorbed into the moisture in the atmosphere, can lead to acid rain. Acid rain can then fall on farmland, which can damage farmland, damage crops. It can have an impact on cattle as well. So there's quite a range of impacts. And that actually, remember, will be an environmental impact as well as being an economic impact. So it's quite an important impact that can potentially be, and was, a long-term impact as well. An awful lot of people just couldn't afford to rebuild their houses as well. As we said previously, there was no insurance. Where do they get the money from to rebuild the houses? It's almost impossible for them to do that. So that again is a very, very long-term problem. 120,000 homeless people. Once people started to come back from being evacuated, obviously 12,500 homes destroyed, an awful lot of homes damaged. So you suddenly had a situation where you got 120,000 people that got nowhere to live, no food, no water, and something had to happen. There had to be some sort of relief effort that was involved in bringing this city back to at least somewhere close to where it was prior to the eruption. And we're going to talk about the relief effort in a second. Firstly, however, one last economic impact is the seriousness of the disruption to communications within the region. We already knew that communications in this area were very poor. However, once the volcano erupted, as we said, it cut off the airport from the remainder of the town. That just made future communications much more difficult. You've suddenly got a magma flow running through the centre of a city. When it cools, it will cool to solid rock. So you've then got to deal with this solid rock that has just appeared in the middle of your city, potentially gone down some of the main streets. If you Google some pictures of the Nyiragongo eruption, you will see that some of the magma flows went down the main street and actually had quite a severe impact. People couldn't get from one side to the other. There are doors covered up with rock now because it's molten magma and it's cooled. So it had a serious impact on that region. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things. Relief effort itself. Obviously, the United Nations had to get involved because this is a developing country. It didn't have the funds to deal with a hazard of this nature. It didn't really have the skills or the expertise to deal with a hazard of this nature, so consequently the United Nations really needed to get involved. Now, they sent in the first week 260 tonnes of food, so the families that required it received 26 kilograms worth of rations. In the UK, there was a TV appeal. You can still find some videos of that on YouTube. In order to encourage people to give money, we have an organisation called the DEC, which tries to get involved in global hazards in order to make sure that people get treated and get some sort of relief. Governments around the world gave $35 million in order to get aid to refugees. And also emergency measles vaccinations were carried out. Remember we talked about the spread of disease? Well, the World Health Organization came in and tried to combat some of the risks of disease by giving out emergency vaccinations for diseases they felt would cause a major problem. Now, as volcanoes are periodic hazards, this volcano, Nyiragongo, has actually erupted again. Sometimes the eruptions are fairly severe. Sometimes it's almost like an awakening of the volcano. It's very little in terms of its eruptive action. However, one of the more important threats is the activity that's going on under Lake Kivu. So that's the lake where Goma as a city lies, and it's very close to Nyiragongo. Obviously, we've said before that there are sulfur dioxide emissions and also carbon dioxide emissions. One of the things that happen is that these gases will rise up through the earth, and they get trapped in the mud and the sediment that lies at the bottom of Lake Kivu. The fear is that something like Lake Nyos will happen again. Now, Lake Nyos in 1986 was a lake in Cameroon. There was tectonic activity underneath the lake, and carbon dioxide was saturated inside the mud at the bottom of the lake. It's kind of like opening up a bottle of fizzy water. It looks very, very still when you first open it, but as soon as you open that bottle, suddenly all the bubbles rise, the gas tries to escape, and the water bubbles up like crazy. Similar sort of thing happens. All it takes is some minor earthquake or a landslide under the water to disturb all of the sediment at the bottom, and it releases all of that gas. All that gas then escapes, and it will bubble up through the lake, and the carbon dioxide will be released. Now, in Lake Nyos, that was in almost like a bowl, and all of the carbon dioxide emissions after it erupted stayed in the bowl, and literally as it was heavier than the air around it, it seeped over the top of the crater and it went into some of the villages. So people arrived into the villages around Lake Nyos, and they found 1,700 people had died. There was no sign of a struggle. The animals were dead. It was very, very scary for a lot of people. They didn't realise what had actually happened. And the fear is something similar can happen in Lake Kivu. It would only take a small earthquake to disturb the sediment, and Goma, being right next to Lake Kivu, could be in the firing line for carbon dioxide emissions that go straight over the city and there's no oxygen, it pushes it all out, people will suffocate. So it's quite a severe hazard. Okay, so that's our LDC case study, Mount Nyiragongo.